If you want to try adding watercolor effects to your cards, but you're not interested in investing in tons of expensive watercolors and brushes, then this video is for you. Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Keppel, and today I am checking out a set of watercolor markers that Sketchmarker sent me to review. I am super excited to try out these markers because as a beginning watercolorist, I find markers are an easy way to color in stamped images on cards. But the best part about these markers is that they come dual tipped. So there's a brush end and a fine tip end. So first, let's swatch these colors out and let me show you the benefits of these Sketchmarker watercolor markers. Sketchmarker, or they're also known as Sketchbar, have Aqua markers. These are watercolor markers. They have 36 marker sets, and the set that I received is called Balloons. They come in this nice carrying case, and there are trays inside to hold all the markers in place. So you can just pull those trays out and grab what you need, or you can reorganize them, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put them in a rainbow order that works for me. Also included in this marker set is a laminated swatch card, which shows you all the colors, and on the back is the watercolor mini palette where you can mix colors to make your own. They also have a cute little coloring book that you can use to try out the markers. And there's a water brush pen included as well. You just need to fill it up with water by screwing off the top here and adding the water inside the barrel of the marker. As I mentioned, these are exciting because they have a brush tip end and a fine point tip end. So if you're a card maker and you're using these watercolor markers on cards, you can color in tiny little areas of stamped images very easily, and you'll still be able to create that watercolor effect by adding water to the areas that you've placed down. Now, in this palette where I'm going to swatch them out, I am working on watercolor paper. I'm going to use different paper for the stamped images, but this is the Tim Holtz watercolor paper. I just wanted to see how much flow I would get, and actually you get quite a bit. So on the left-hand side, I'm using the brush end of the marker to make a swatch, and then I'm pulling that out with the water. And then on the right-hand side, I use the fine tip end and then pull that back towards the middle. So you can see that both ends watercolor out, or the water makes them flow beautifully so that you don't see the marker swipes. It just ends up with the watercolor effect, which is exactly what you want. That means these are really good quality and they're also really easy to use. There's also a blender pen, so I wanted to see how that worked. So I have two different colors of blue here, and I'm using the blender pen to kind of blend them out in the center, and then I'm going to go in with water and just make this whole area a watercolor effect. So you can use the blender pen as well, but I definitely love using that water brush. And look at these gorgeous colors that are included in this set. Now that you've seen these markers up close, let's use them with some watercolor techniques on cards. I mentioned that these watercolor markers are great for coloring in stamped images for card makers. So I am going to use Simon Hurley's Butterfly Kisses stamp set. I am stamping with the Stamp Market's watercolor ink. It's a black ink that is safe to use with watercolor. And I'm stamping on Strathmore Bristol Smooth paper. So it is not technically a watercolor paper, but I won't be using that much water, and it is super smooth, so it allows the markers to move around and the color to blend and move. So I'm stamping out flowers and butterflies and all kinds of things, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, once the ink is fully dried, to color in this flower. And what I'm going to start with is just a line of color close to the black outline of the stamp. This is really easy to do with the brush tip because this is a larger image. If you're struggling with that brush tip, then move over to the fine tip for a smaller image. Then come in with the watercolor water brush and use some water and pull out that color towards the other side of the petal. So I will just do a few petals at a time so that the ink doesn't dry too much touch, and it'll have the most amount of mobility. It will move the most, it will blend out the most, and it will cause that beautiful watercolor effect where you have a darker part of the petal and a much lighter part of the petal where there is the most amount of water. That was so easy to do. I can't even describe to you how easy that is. It's even easier than blending out markers because you're only using one color and you are just blending it out with plain water. Here, the petals were a little bit smaller, so I did want to show you how nice it is to use that fine tip and I'm doing the same thing. I'm just going close to the black outline because that's going to be the darkest part of those petals. So I'm just going around there with the color and then taking the water brush marker, the water brush, to just blend out that color. So it is, again, even with the fine tip and a less amount of the marker ink, it still blends out easily and beautifully with the water brush. As I mentioned, just do a few petals at a time, but once you get the hang of it, you can see how much you can do without the ink drying. I was able to do that whole section without the ink drying very much at all. For the leaves, I am going to do the same thing, only I'm going to go right over the veins of the leaves with the marker. I'm using the brush end tip. You can use either tip that you want, and then I'm using the water brush to blend that out. So I'm not going to completely blend out the veins of the leaves. I want those to stay as dark as possible, but I will blend them out a little bit so that they are not looking like a marker swipe or a pen line. So definitely blend them out a touch, but leave them dark so that you can see that those are veins. And I did a lighter color of green on the upper flower. So that was a direct to paper technique. We were directly drawing with the marker on the paper and then blending it out with the water brush. This is the watercolor palette technique. So you can just scribble down some color on that palette and then pick it up with the water brush. That way you could actually mix colors if you want, or you can just create a much lighter look. I'm going back to direct to paper with this butterfly, and I'm just going to put down a good chunk of color and then blend it out towards the bottom of those top areas of the wings. So I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom areas of the wings. I'm not going into all those little tiny crevices. You absolutely could, with the nib end especially, go in there and color in different colors. I wanted this done a little bit more quickly, so I decided to just do 2 colors on the butterflies and then a different color for the body. And again, just blending out, put down a little color, right direct to the paper, and then blend it out with that water brush. Here, I'm just going to go around with a large amount of color and then blend that out, and then a small amount of color for the darker color and blend that out, and then the body as well. So each of these has 2 different colors. Each butterfly has 2 different colors, one for the top wings and one for the bottom wings, and then they're just blended out with that water brush. I decided to use a totally different color for the body here, just something a little bit different, but these are just really easy to do this way. If you wanted to add much more color to them, you absolutely could. But if you're going for an easy beginner introduction to using these, you can absolutely do this type of watercoloring as well. And I think they look really beautiful even with just 2 colors on them. So don't feel like you have to go crazy just because you have the 2 tips. I did use the nibs, the tip end, to do the little dots in the center. This butterfly actually has a body that is a separate stamp. So I die cut it out, and now I put it back into the positive piece that I die cut out so that I could stamp that body and heat emboss it with gold embossing powder. I thought that would look pretty cool on that butterfly. And now I'm going to use the matching dies to cut out all these images, and I'm holding them in place with Thermoweb's Pixie tape so that they won't move around in my die cut machine. Once all of those images were die cut out and watercolored, I decided to create some backgrounds. I treated some of the Strathmore Bristol Smooth with anti-static powder tool, and I'm stamping Simon Hurley's Flowering Mandala with Versamark ink. And then I'm going to pour some brass embossing powder on top and then heat set that to melt that embossing powder. This mandala is absolutely beautiful, and I thought it would go really well with those watercolor butterflies. But I also wanted to watercolor the background. So for another watercolor technique, you can just get some of the ink onto the palette and then get a lot of water mixed into it. Use the water brush to then pull that out across the card background. Now, the embossed mandala will resist that watercolor, which is perfect because you get the color on that white background, and then the brass will still remain that color, so it'll be shiny with a beautiful soft watercolor background. So I'm going to go into the next color, and you can see that I overlap the colors just a touch so that they blend together. These watercolor markers blend beautifully. So you can see there are no harsh lines between the colors. They blend together to create additional colors, and that's something that you can do on your images or on your backgrounds. Now I'm going to pop up the butterflies diagonally across from each other around this mandala on some foam tape just to give them a little bit of dimension. Then I'm going to use the same ink that I used to stamp the butterflies to stamp a sentiment that is from that same stamp set that says, "Spread your wings and fly." So very easy to create this card, but so much fun to create those watercolors in the images and the background. This time I'm going to stamp the flowering mandala off the side of the card. So it's just going to show part of the image. I'm also going to use anti-static powder and Versamark ink, which will hold that embossing powder in place. But this time I'm going to use white embossing powder. So you won't see it at first because it's white embossing powder on the white cardstock. I'm going to hold it up with my Simon Says stamp hot hands or helping hands. And then I'm going to use the palette again. So just scrub some color. You can scrub more than one color down at a time, and then use the water brush to move that color around. You could mix those colors. What I'm going to do is start with the darkest color at the top again, and you can see that as I go down the image that the white embossing powder, once it's heat set like that, it is resisting the watercolor. So you get this gorgeous watercolor effect background, and then you get that stamped heat embossed image of the mandala shining through in white. So again, go through with 3 different colors or more if you want, and you can see the gradient of color that they create. The more water you use, the lighter the color will be. The less water you use, the darker the color will be. I like to use a significant amount of water, even though I'm working on that Bristol cardstock, which is not watercolor cardstock. It will warp a little bit because of that, but that's okay. And the palette is easy to clean, just wipe it away. Next, I'm going to trim this panel down a little bit so I know exactly how much space I have left for my sentiment. The sentiment is also from that same Butterfly Kisses stamp set. I'm going to use anti-static powder tool on that watercolor background. It needs to be fully dry before I do this, and then stamp the sentiment with Versamark ink so that I can use some gold embossing powder on top and then heat set that. I'm going to put a bunch of tape runner behind this panel. Because it did warp a little bit, I'm going to adhere it down to an A2 piece of the same white cardstock. This way it will flatten it out. Then I'm going to pop up these flowers on foam tape and have them hanging off the left-hand edge a little bit. I'm going to double pop up the butterfly, so 2 pieces of foam tape on top of each other. Then flip the card over and cut off the excess, anything that was hanging. I didn't like it flush to the white, so I picked up the whole thing and moved it over so it was flush to the watercolor background. And finally, I'm going to use some white gel pen to add in some details. If you ever want more of those highlights and you didn't get them, although you can see the watercolor does provide them quite a bit, you can add white gel details to add some more of those highlights. Whether you're a beginning watercolorist or more advanced, I think these markers would be a great addition to your stash and would be a great way to add watercolor effects to your cards. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of these watercolor markers. I'd love to hear if you're interested in checking them out. Let me know in the comments below. YouTube thinks you might be interested in checking out this video next. As always, I want to thank you so much for stopping by and spending time with me today. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you again soon. But can you do it later when I don't have as much light and then you can do your thing loud outside? That'd be great. Thanks.